Good afternoon. It's the 23rd of November 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, with me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we will be joined today by live video Skype link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Well, a bit of comment on the weather. Seems to have calmed down everywhere. Understand it's quite sunny up in Scotland at the moment. I think that's mid-east Scotland. London is a bit on the cloudy side, as is Plymouth, and it's a little bit chilly still. But not to worry, because we're about to warm you up with the autumn statement.
Yeah, a bit cloudy in Parliament. So Philip Hammond, autumn statement. Now, unfortunately, of course, he started sometime around 12:30, and we were already in final preparations for this programme, so we haven't heard his actual statement. However, all the discussion prior to this, I don't doubt there are going to be very many surprises in it. A £1.4 billion cash injection for housing, apparently. Changes to universal credit, so they're going to give people more. Like, what is it they said? 2 pence in every pound increase in universal credit, so that's great. And national living wage is going to increase to $7.50 an hour, so that's fantastic too. 40,000 new homes going to be built. And of course, they're going to spend billions on new roads. But of course, that won't be the surface of the roads. No, because that would mean it would be easier to drive from one place to another. They're going to spend £1.3 billion on new roads infrastructure, which is mainly fibre optic cabling and
road charging.
Road charging is on its way, indeed. So instead of looking at the detail of that, I thought we'd look at some statistics that were pushed out by government just prior. And this was, of course, the great news of government borrowing, which, as you can see, is coming down, Brian. Still in the region. It
did go up, but it's coming down.
Yeah, still in the region of 80 billion a year, and from its highs of 160 billion a year. But as you can see, since 2001, we've been doing really well in handling government debt. So let's look at it as a percentage of GDP. There we go. That's the graph showing the percentage of GDP at its peak around 2009 and coming down ever since. And the dotted line there is what the Office for Budget Responsibility suggests is possibly, maybe, perhaps going to be what's going to happen in the future. So what's that by 2020? They expect it to be in surplus. Now, surplus doesn't mean that they've paid off the debt, of course, as we can see, because, of course, to pay off just this little bit of debt that's been accrued since 2007, they've got to pay back everything in that blue triangle there. Well,
that's never going to happen.
That's not going to happen, indeed. Yeah. And then, of course, what have we got? Quarterly real GDP growth. Well, this looks fantastic. 0.5% for about the last 4 or 5 years. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to do a comparison chart between this and China, for example. But frankly, this is just embarrassing. And then, of course, what have we got here? This is even more embarrassing. Changes in sector output compared with pre-recession peak output in 2008. So this is looking at how various industries have done by comparison with where they were in 2008. As we can see, services sector seems to be doing okay, but industrial production continues to languish along the bottom, bouncing along the bottom there at about minus 10% of where it was in 2008.
That's a fascinating graph, Mike, because of course we're absolutely showing the devastation of UK's industrial production, and we've been particularly mentioning our inability to build anything, ships, warships, whatever it is, problems with steel. But fascinating that money is still available for construction. So we're not producing anything, but we're building more and more stuff for what?
Well, for immigration, mainly.
For immigration.
So then, of course, we've got this. This is the UK's exchange rate. Now, of course, we know that the pound has only been collapsing since Brexit. And of course, this graph puts the lie to that because there's an absolute clear trend since November 2015 of the direction of the pound relative to other currencies. So, we were actually speaking about this before the programme between ourselves about how Brexit is being blamed for every piece of news. The fact of the matter is that that trend has been established for quite some time, for over a year. well before any suggestion of Brexit. And then we've got producer price increases, and of course this is what's going to lead into inflation. As we can see from the middle of 2015, there's been a definite upward trend on that as well. But of course, this is all the responsibility of Brexit too. And then if we look at current account and trade balance of payments, what have we got? We've got massive negative since 2007. So that situation continues not to improve. And of course, what that means is, among other things, that EU markets sell more into the UK than we sell to the EU. So who's going to care most about whether we are in or out? That's that. So anyway, the autumn statement will quite possibly have finished by this point, and no doubt we'll see later exactly what he's done. But we don't need to worry because Britain's economy is in a fantastic state. And it's going to take us forward without any problems whatsoever.
Take us forward to the change agenda. We will be transformed into a nation that manufactures nothing.
Now, as Brian said, we've got Mark Anderson with us. So let's look at the latest edition of American Free Press. And really, Mark, there's three separate subjects here, and we're going to look at these in a bit more detail. But of course, the two main arguments are over these global trade deals. And also the media in the United States. What do you make of the present situation with Trump?
Boy, there's a lot that could be said, Mike. Regarding the media, the New York Post just reported, and I may have shared this.
We'll come on to this. So
yes.
Let's not talk about the New York Post specifically, but just generally.
Well, Trump is coming out very aggressively to get his own message directly to the American people. There's a very viral video out there right now from the Trump transition team, and everybody's impression from InfoWars and many other observers across the board is that Trump is taking his message directly to the people and doing, to some degree, an end run around the media that he recently dressed down. And as you say, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The articles you're showing there, mainstream media utterly humiliated, that shows William Kristol, the neocon editor of the Weekly Standard. That article talks about the McAllen, Texas election return get-together that I went to recently on November 8th, talking to local Republicans, showing them American Free Press, talking about alternative media. And I found that many people, once you talk about it, are ready for a different media, that the Trump campaign proved that the media are the real deplorables, not the American middle class. Hillary Clinton tried to label the middle class. She tried to call the middle class and the working class deplorables, but that the media are the real deplorables. And some sort of alternative media structure is needed because the credibility of the U.S. mainstream media is zero or near zero. Certainly, it's suffering very badly. And it's going to be interesting in the next few months to see what the media does to try and regain the public's trust. In terms of global trade deals, we can discuss that too. I see you have that headline up as well.
Right. So will Trump end global trade deals? Well, in fact, the news from today was this quote or from yesterday rather, on trade, I'm going to issue a notification of intent to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And on the BBC this morning, they were clearly upset about this, very upset about it. And in fact, the Telegraph today also extremely upset about this. They had an article telling us today how great British free trade is and how we've got to work really, really hard to make sure that British free trade doesn't end up in the bin. Well, he's saying he's going to get out of TPP. On the BBC, they had the Australian trade minister talking about TPP, and they're saying, Australia is going to go ahead no matter what happens, no matter whether Trump actually fulfills this statement or not. But he has been a critic of this for quite a long time.
He's been consistent here. He has not been consistent on all issues, but on this one, he's perhaps been the most consistent. And in that Trump transition team video that's gotten some 2.5 million hits on YouTube, that's where he specifically said to the American people that he would withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I might add that his idea to have Dan DeMico as the U.S. trade representative. That's Donald Trump's proposed nominee for that post. And that post, if Dan DeMico does fill that post, he comes out of the North Carolina kind of industrial working class. He wrote a book or a paper about the advantages of having more American-made production, how U.S.-made production will help our country. So if Trump's nominee or proposed nominee for U.S. trade representative comes through, we have someone who's not cut from the same cloth as the current U.S. trade rep Michael Froman, who's not cut from the same cloth as other U.S. trade reps that have come from the Bilderberg list, and so on and so forth. So far, Trump is showing a lot of promise in turning the corner on trade and not going the same old internationalist route that other presidents have went. So we'll see what happens, but that's another indication that Trump may very well stick to his guns on the 12-nation TPP treaty.
Right. So the other issue that we need to talk about here is the media impact on this, because he's been an absolute critic of the media. And you have a headline on your own Truthhound website here saying, "Deliberate chaos, constant media lies about the right, hide vast internationalist meddling that plays the left against the right." Again, this morning on the BBC, they're really hammering Breitbart. They're saying that Breitbart is becoming Trump's personal propaganda machine, and they're really suggesting that they're highlighting what they're describing as the alt-right. They're saying that the alt-right has come straight out of the Ku Klux Klan, and they're really pushing this white supremacist story. This really is an attempt to argue that the entire world, the alternative media, everybody has lurched massively to the right. We're all white supremacists. We don't want to see anybody else in our countries under any circumstances. I mean, it is sheer desperation on the part of the mainstream media, isn't it?
I believe so. The left has always been more revolutionary than the right. What I noted on this column at thetruthhound.com, my blog, is that while the left and right paradigm is largely a tennis match for us to watch the ball going back and forth and to keep us diverted from large issues, and you and I, Mike and Brian, we've never been taken in by the left-right standoff that's used as a diversion. However, it's important to note what you just mentioned, Mike, and that's that they're acting as if any rightward trajectory, any change, even slightly to the right in the economic and political direction of the different nations of the world, is literally on par with disaster, which is utter nonsense. For one thing, the right has never been good at the group thing, as I mentioned in my column. The right is largely individualistic people working in small associations, and they just don't have the wherewithal to get into massive group protests like the left does. And the left has been largely behind the juggernaut in our courts against laws that prevent same-sex marriage, working for abortion, working for cultural revolutionary kind of movements. And so the left has always been largely in control and getting its way. And the internationalists in our upper tiers of our system and the left have kind of a symbiosis, in that internationalism is much more a left-leaning thing than it is a right-leaning thing. And therefore, anything that smacks of the right, no matter how slightly, is labeled, as you say, KKK, white supremacist, because internationalism relies a lot on the revolutionary left and that kind of outlook to get its way, to make progress in the world. If you start talking about the right and you start moving that direction even a little, then you get a more populist, nationalist level philosophy, and the internationalist system, economic and political, begins to crumble. And so there are people on the right that are misguided. There are right-wing ideas and groups that I wouldn't want anything to do with. But the left has proven itself to be much more revolutionary, much more adept at pushing the internationalist chess pieces across the globe. And so we have to recognize that Breitbart may not be the perfect news organization. The alt-right may have its flaws, but the internationalist media and the internationalist establishment has relied on the left to be kind of the tip of the spear. And so now they're falsely mislabeling and unfairly mislabeling pro-Trump people as white supremacists, pro-Brexit people as white supremacists, and trying to tie it all together in one big package and have this scare story that there's this massive rising of the right, and the next thing you know, Hitler will be back, and it's all just a bunch of bravado. It's hyperbole to the highest degree, and there's no factual basis in it.
Okay, well, of course, the other story is the media, Trump criticizing them heavily during the campaign itself. Glenn Greenwald here, his headline is Media Stars Agreed Off-the-Record Meeting with Trump, Break Agreement, Whine About Mistreatment. So this was a meeting that took place in Trump Towers yesterday, and many of the sort of main news anchors from all the mainstream American news channels were there, including and then as well editors and various other people from the print media, and it was supposed to be an off-the-record meeting. Well, you highlighted this New York Post article, which really seems to sum up some of the whining from them, because Donald Trump's media summit was a effing firing squad, according to the New York Post. That is a spectacular headline for a mainstream outlet.
It is. The New York Post has always been a little bit edgier. It's in that chasm between the New York Times, a more sedate paper, and the more puerile tabloids. The New York Post is somewhere in the middle, maybe leaning a little more toward the tabloids in terms of its style. But this is very significant. On one level, you have the George Stephanopoulos of the world and Wolf Blitzer, who's a former lobbyist for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, one of the most influential lobbies on Capitol Hill. That's where Wolf Blitzer came from before he became the CNN wonk. And he was there, and David Muir, the nightly anchor of ABC, was there. George Stephanopoulos, who's always with ABC, he's shown there in that posting you have. And the head of CNN was there, for whom Blitzer works, and a number of others. And it's good in the sense that Trump dressed them down over their decidedly unfair and incendiary coverage of the Trump-Clinton campaign and their pushing of the known criminality and scandals of Hillary, and still trying to push her into the White House. That being said, another question that I think we've always often asked to be consistent on the UK column is that would this somehow morph into media government control of the media when Trump is elected? Would he take his disgust with the media to the next step and begin any kind of censorship or anti-First Amendment things, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, going a little too far in his antagonism toward the media, which was antagonistic toward him? And that it's a little too early to tell. There's already articles posted on whether Trump would open up the libel laws, quote unquote, and allow more government lawsuits against media, which would be rather unprecedented if it were to happen, at least on any large scale. It's, as I say, it's too early to tell about that, but naturally, we don't want Trump's understandable criticism of the media to morph into something like the Leveson affair or any kind of government censorship of the media. That would be an improper thing to do, and we'll have to see what happens there.
Okay, well, look, just finally on this issue, let's have a quick chat about some of his nominations for the people that he's got around him. But first of all, this again from your Truthhound website. Rand Paul's logic on Face the Nation sets constitutional test for Trump nominations.
Yeah, this was very interesting. I just happened to catch it Sunday on this weekly news magazine, CBS Face the Nation, kind of like NBC Meet the Press. And Rand Paul really brought a refreshing perspective to the table. Look, I supported Donald Trump, and many people that don't believe in an interventionist foreign policy wanted Trump in there because he said that the Iraq war was a mistake. Trump was quoted as saying that in 15 years of the war on terror, the U.S. has spent $6 trillion and our infrastructure is crumbling. Rand Paul brought this back out and said, according to my job in the advice and consent function of the Senate, all of Trump's nominees have to be signed off by the Senate. He can't just appoint whoever he wants in cabinet posts. So the Senate's advice and consent function, as spelled out of the Constitution, will be front and center, Rand Paul said, and we're going to hold him to it. And he said he doesn't want to have a regime change kind of administration. So if that's true, what Trump said about Iraq, that overthrowing Saddam Hussein and regime change in Iraq was a mistake, then I, Rand Paul, want to help Donald Trump stick to his guns and pick people for his cabinet positions that will continue that idea that we should avoid regime change in Syria, that regime change in Libya was a bad idea, that regime change in Iraq was a bad idea. Let's learn our lessons and not do the same thing in Iran, not do the same thing in Syria. And that's what Rand Paul's trying to do, help Donald Trump be consistent against regime change and pick people for cabinet positions that will avoid that interventionist regime change mindset and get the U.S. out of this full-bore global cop mode that we've been in for far too long. And much could be said about the nominees, but one particularly interesting one is Defense Secretary, however, Duncan Hunter and Tom Cotton, who are members of Congress. Duncan Hunter, a California congressman, and Tom Cotton, a Arkansas senator, both Republicans. Both are largely war hawks, although Duncan Hunter did say in 2013 that he did not want the U.S. to attack Syria over alleged chemical gas attacks against its own people without the consent of Congress. Duncan Hunter did make that congressional input on war action very explicit. However, Hunter and Cotton are largely war hawks. So right there for Defense Secretary, that's contradicting what Rand Paul hoped for the Trump campaign. And then Stephen J. Hadley is another one, and he openly advocated bombing Syria in 2013 and owns a bunch of stock in defense contract companies. And yet Stephen J. Hadley is on the board of directors of the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. So, he's into defense contract shares, something like 12,000 shares on the Peace Institute board, and yet comes out of the Council on Foreign Relations, your version of Chatham House, and had advocated bombing Syria in 2013. And meanwhile, Duncan Hunter, the California congressman I mentioned, has advocated bombing Iran under certain circumstances, though he says he hopes that we're never in a conflict with Iran. So Donald Trump is really going to have to be careful here. He's getting surrounded or is surrounding himself with war-prone neocons who are far apart from what Rand Paul hoped for.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. We'll move on now to, we always like to have Priti Patel on the program because,
she's got black nails.
Yes. And of course, a couple of weeks ago, we were pointing out that UK aid budget was going to be spent on trade and trade opportunities rather than aid. This is a bit strange. So at the time, she was saying our focus on poverty is poverty reduction, but that doesn't mean we should exclude the whole area of trade and trade opportunities. She said British soft power is exactly where the Department for International Development and our aid and other relationships around the world come together to deliver in our national interest when it comes to free trade agreements, but also life post-Brexit. So she's talking about soft power. Well, today she has announced a raise in the budget for this organization, CDC Group. Now, this was formerly the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and she has announced that the government is going to raise the amount that they give to CDC Group from £1.5 billion in the next 3 years to £6 billion in the next 3 years. So what is this organization? Well, it funds vulture funds of a type. It funds private investment companies that go into third world countries and asset strip them, perhaps. So what do? They say that they are the UK's development finance institution and wholly owned by the UK government. They say that their mission is to support the building of businesses throughout Africa and South Asia and to create jobs and make lasting difference to people's lives. This is British soft power at its best. It's couched in wonderful language, but it never quite delivers what it says it's going to deliver. They were founded, they say, in 1948, making it the world's largest development finance institution. Businesses in developing countries often struggle to find investment they need to grow. So this is a way for the government to invest in a particular type of business in countries where it has no particular influence, and to promote certain policies by investing in certain types of businesses that are in certain types of industry sectors, whether that be cashless society or surveillance, whatever the government agenda happens to be. So they're going to stick £6 billion into that. That's got to be good, doesn't it?
I don't see how they can do that, Mike, because surely we don't have any money at the moment. We're told that we've got to cut everything, the NHS, defence, schools, roads, because we don't have any money, but they've got $6 billion for burrowing their way into other countries to help influence their political system.
Because they're simply lying.
They're lying. Well, just a reminder that actually, as we speak, we've got John Hirst is due in court in Llandudno Wells Magistrates Court. This is due to the fact that John has a number of disagreements over paying council tax, which is ultimately being misappropriated and including other things used for terrorist activity by the UK government. We are waiting for an update as to obviously what's going to happen from that hearing, and we will report as soon as we've got some information. We'll also remind our viewers and listeners today that Robert Greene is under quite intense pressure again at the moment. He's surprisingly being pursued by the Scottish state for costs relating to a civil court case. So we're very puzzled as to how this works. The court case was the original case with Eilish Angelini, who was the then head of the Scottish law system, but nevertheless it was a civil case between Robert and Ms. Angelini. However, all of a sudden, the demand for costs with the threat of enforcement by bailiffs has actually come from the Scottish government itself. So it appears that in Scotland, the law is sort of a little bit, it can drift between civil matters and the government between cases, doesn't really matter. At the moment, we have a number of people who've offered to support Robert, and we will keep you updated with that. But if we want an indication of how devious the present government is in its dealings with the law, thank you very much to the lady who highlighted this letter. Now, the letter has come from Elizabeth Truss, who's Lord Truss, who is Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice. And we should remember that this lady has absolutely no qualifications at law whatsoever. So clearly ideal for the job, Mike.
Yep.
So this is the letter. And basically, she's replying to an MP and saying that as a result of a particular case, a change in the law has not occurred. So I'll just read the second paragraph. The Right Honourable Gove MP wrote to you on the 11th of December 2015 to explain that the Supreme Court was already considering a case involving parasitic accessory liability, and that my department would write again when the outcome was known. The court delivered its judgment, that's R versus Yogi, on the 18th February 2016, effectively abolishing this strand of liability and going a long way, we suspect, to addressing previous committee members' concerns. And then the highlighted paragraph with the arrow tells us what this parasitic accessory liability is. Prior to the court's judgment, parasitic accessory liability arose where two people participated together in one offence, e.g. a burglary, and in the course of events, person one committed a second offence, e.g. he or she murdered a security guard. If person two foresaw that person one might act with the intention to kill or cause really serious harm and participated in the burglary, regardless, he/she would be guilty of murder as well as person one. Now, the key point is that the judges in that particular case of the 18th of February 2016 have thrown this out. But what our eagle-eyed viewer picked up was, of course, this meant that behind the scenes, the government was actually working extremely hard to get in another layer of thought crime. You hadn't actually committed the crime, but you'd thought about it. And of course, this was being tied in with the fact that locally we're seeing police issue warnings to people, which is literally based on thought crime. So one letter, we're going to look at this obviously in more detail, but it's giving us more evidence that, of course, we're seeing a tightening up of the court system, secret courts, press excluded, public excluded, juries excluded. And we've got Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, as Mike reported yesterday, talking about secret arrests and suppression of investigative journalism. Dangerous stuff, I think.
Yes. What's next? Oh, Syria. Syria. This is pretty spectacular. And Mark, I'm springing this on you, but you might have something to say. This is Samantha Power speaking in the UN Security Council a day or two ago. Well, she's decided that she is going to name 13 officers of the Syrian army, 13 commanders, and she's accusing them of involved in the killing and injuring of civilians since 2011. She said the United States will not let those who have commanded units involved in these actions hide anonymously behind the facade of the Assad regime. Those behind such attacks must know that we and the international community are watching their actions, documenting their abuses, and one day they will be held accountable. So she's picked on 13 of them. Interesting. The Russians, in turn, said, you went as far as naming Syrian commanders and generals, but if you claim to be unbiased, why don't we hear the names of the terrorists as well? Who will deal with them? Really, this, again, an indication of how utterly, well, you used the word insane earlier on, some of these people are acting at the moment, Mark.
Indeed. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the Assad regime is absolutely blameless in every nook and cranny of this ongoing conflict, but it's clear that the West, the US, and the British governments have not proven their case. They're going with the old mantra that if we say it, it must be so. And that's just not going to cut the mustard. In the alternative press, we get a much clearer picture. When I was watching CNN the other day, however, they were talking as if the Assad regime was almost largely or almost totally responsible, that is, for virtually every bombed out neighborhood. And they kept referring to the terrorists as rebels. And so the mainstream media narrative in the West is that while they might say ISIS specifically, and of course portray them as terrorists and aggressors to some degree, then they'll turn around and say that the Syrian government under Assad are the aggressors and that anyone else is a rebel who's trying to overthrow the regime in concert with the US. So there's this constant blurring of the lines where most of the time the Assad regime is blamed. Once in a while, ISIS is named as a malefactor, but oftentimes then they blur the lines between ISIS and this nebulous reference to rebels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that of course is a witch's brew of different terrorist groups and opportunists and soldiers of fortune, many of whom are from English-speaking countries, and they come from all over the world, showing up like a musician with a guitar in his case, except it's a gun, and they get out and say, "Where's my gig? Pay me money and I'll shoot whoever you want." And that's what it is. A lot of freelancers out there putting the masks on so you can't tell one ISIS fighter from another. Some of them have British accents or American accents, and the media is largely to blame. The weaponized media, as I call it in a book I'm working on, by not getting this straight, by not getting this clear. Then the Samantha Powers of the world can make these statements, and many people can't see through the lies and the half truths, and understand the fact that she has to prove her case. Saying it does not make it so.
That's absolutely the case.
I'm now going to smile because you couldn't have given me a better introduction to this story from the Daily Mail. Here we are. Actually, just on the picture at the moment, you look at the balaclava and the jeans and the weapons, you could think that is ISIS on the streets, but apparently that's the good guys, that's police. But the headline, ISIS suspects arrested in France at the weekend, plan to target a theme park and an area with a high police presence. And I've put a caption in there, be afraid, new alleged terror plot supports more arrests. Well, let's have a look at the reporting here, because it says ISIS suspects arrested in France at the weekend were planning to target a theme park and an area with a high police presence, it's been claimed. So perhaps we ought to just highlight this is purely fiction, this is a claim. We go on to the next bit. The alleged terror ring may have been plotting an attack on a theme park, according to French media, though no specific target was revealed. So we've got nothing in that statement at all either. And we'll go on through because the Interior Minister, Bernard Cazeneuve, he got very excited and said police detained 7 alleged plotters from France, Morocco, Afghanistan, foiling what was called a long-planned terror attack on our soil. So it's maybe, might have, could be, but this is a long planned.
Excuse me.
So I think we'll add the final bit is where is the evidence for these claims? And this is your point, Mark. There is absolutely no substance in this story whatsoever.
So we might call this fake news.
I would call it fake news. Absolutely outrageous. There is no substance to the story. There's no evidence whatsoever put forward.
Disney characters?
Disney characters in jeans. And if we want to see how bad it gets, now this is from a couple of weeks ago, but it's Andrew Parker from MI5. He says that an increasingly aggressive Russia is a growing threat to UK. What is he really saying? Be afraid. And let's look at what he says. Russia poses an increasing threat to the stability of the UK and is using all the sophisticated tools at its disposal to achieve its aims. Absolutely no evidence put forward in the article. And since we've been cutting British military forces to the bone over the last few years, presumably we didn't really understand Russia was a threat, Mike.
You must be right about that. Now the Russians, of course, they continue to react to what's going on their borders, and this is Viktor Ozerov, who's chairman of the Russian Defense and Security Committee, and he's pointing out that Russia is now moving infrastructure to the Russian border to counter the anti-ballistic missile system that the Americans are putting right up against their borders. The quote here says, one of the reasons why Russia opposed the deployment of the American anti-ballistic missile system in Europe was the concern that this infrastructure may be quickly converted to deploy strike systems, in particular land-based cruise missiles. But look, the Russians don't need to worry because John Kirby, who must be the most credible spokesman for the US government I've ever seen, and just to clarify with anybody that isn't sure, I'm being as sarcastic as I could possibly be here. He said that NATO is a defensive alliance, as he was saying this to RT yesterday. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's always been a defensive alliance. It will remain a defensive alliance. He said there's no reason for anybody in Russia to feel threatened by NATO's activities or preparations. Preparations for what? Right? And, you know, as we highlighted yesterday, the largest scale NATO exercise in the Balkans, in Lithuania, rather. I've spelled Lithuania wrong. That's embarrassing. Iron Sword, 2016, going on at the moment. But the Russians don't need to worry because this is just preparations.
It's just preparations. But of course, to emphasize to people that moving up so-called defensive systems right onto the Russian border, this all cuts down warning time about what's going on. So it's automatically a threat. The US knows it's a threat. NATO knows it's a threat. UK knows that this is threatening military action. So for the West to try and say that this is actually a defensive maneuver is a complete lie. Well, let's take this to another level, and we'll stick with the Mail. And here it is. It says Russia unveils its robo-tank, which will be used to defend missile launchers placed near its borders with NATO. And there's a picture of this little vehicle. This is actually a reconnaissance defense vehicle. It's carrying a machine gun. It's not very big. If the man was standing alongside it, he'd be taller than this little robotic vehicle. But of course, the underlying propaganda is be afraid of this new Russian terror weapon. And the article backs it up because we've got effectively a nice Cold War map of Europe coming here. And we've got in the blue boxes, these are land-based Aegis systems. These are part of the missile systems that are causing a problem to Russia, moved right up into the eastern part of Europe. And then the bad guys, the Russians in red as usual, it's labeling at the top left there that they're installing nuclear missiles. So the West is not doing anything at all. We're just putting a few defensive systems in, but those nasty Russians are moving in nuclear weapons. Oh, and by the way, they've also emphasized that those nasty Russians annexed Ukraine. Well, they add a bit more because the Mail is here gloating that this little tank, when it got on some sand dunes, slipped down and fell over. So I'm just going to say to people, there's a bit of a mixed message in the propaganda. We've got to be afraid of those nasty Russians, or we shouldn't be afraid because they're incompetent with building little tanks. Of course, these tanks seem to work quite well in all conditions. Here they are in the snow, unlike some of the Navy's latest Type 45 ships, which unfortunately don't work in warm water because we've just discovered the water's warm. And for you, Mark, I'm afraid we have to bring in this one because it took Russia today to say that the US Navy stealth destroyer has had to be towed into port after another breakdown. This is £4 billion worth of warship, the USS Zumwalt, and apparently it was on its way to the Panama Canal, but they had a problem with the glands around the propeller shafts. They were letting in water, so there was a bit of embarrassment as the tug took it back. So it appears that the Russians are not doing too well on mini tanks, but the US is having trouble with a billion dollar warship that seems to be leaking.
And apparently the best thing they decided they could do with it was just to crash it into the wall of the canal.
It's been bumping into the wall of the canal as well.
It's a shame. Mark, is your Navy becoming as an embarrassment to the United States as ours is to the United Kingdom?
Perhaps in a sense. It looks like that destroyer is the equivalent of the F-35 in the water. A plane that can't fly and a boat that can barely float. Last I knew, you don't want boats to take on water. Maybe unless you were hit by a torpedo, then you expect it to take on water. I guess we're just clueless. We just don't understand that maybe boats shouldn't float and planes shouldn't fly, and that's the way they make them now, and spend billions of dollars in the process. But of course, it's part and parcel of this internationalist warfare state that we're forced to endure. All the economic adjustments and all the different diplomatic adjustments to avoid these large-scale wars are in our knowledge banks. We know what to do, but the internationalist establishment wants to keep the specter of fear going, as you guys have outlined, because it's profitable. Even though we don't have to have all this conflict or even lurch toward this conflict, none of this has to happen. It's forced upon us. Russia is not this intractable foe that we're told it is. Granted, no superstate can be totally trusted in every sinew of its existence, every strand of what it does. You always have to trust but verify. We know this. But clearly, NATO is the aggressor, not just with the Operation Iron Sword, as you guys noted, a very large, unprecedentedly large military exercise right near the Russian border, but NATO's been expanding, and adding more members, moving toward Russia in that sense all along. And yet, as I covered at the Chicago Global Affairs Council recently, as I reported before on here, Anders Rasmussen, the former head of NATO, he too said, we're not trying to encircle Russia. We're not trying to threaten Russia. Complete Orwellian nonsense.
Yeah.
These kind of military exercises would be the equivalent of another country doing them on the Canadian border near North Dakota or near the top of Minnesota or something.
Right. Well, look, Mark, sorry, we are running out of time, so I'm going to have to stop you there because that is a great segue into the next section.
Sure, go ahead.
Because a couple of days ago or a week or so ago, we were talking about the militarization of the police and the merging between police and military functions. And in fact, it was NATO that was promoting this, and I was pointing out that NATO has been promoting this for quite some time, and in coordination with the European Union. And I was pointing out this particular weapon here, this less lethal weapon. It's effectively a baton round weapon, so this is exactly what we're seeing now in Europe. We're not really seeing too much of this yet, but in the United States, it's clearly a bit further along. So speaking of North Dakota, this is the pipeline protest, and this report saying 13-year-old girl shot in the face with a plastic bullet, what we would call a plastic bullet. Tribal leader in critical condition as police assault the protesters. And the statement that was made by the protesters was that hundreds of water protectors were injured at the Standing Rock encampments when law enforcement blasted them with water cannons in freezing temperatures on Sunday evening. The attacks came as water protectors used a semi-truck to remove burnt military vehicles the police had chained in concrete barriers a week ago, blocking traffic on Highway 1806. Water protectors' efforts to clear the road and improve access to the camp for emergency services were met with tear gas, a long-range acoustic device, stinger grenades, rubber bullets, and indiscriminate use of water cannon with an air temperature of 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Some flares shot by law enforcement started grass fires, which were ignored by the water cannons and had to be extinguished by water protectors. Law enforcement also shot down 3 media drones and targeted journalists with so-called less lethal rounds. So the situation at that protest is clearly getting worse. But the main point I'm trying to make here, Brian and Mark, is this increasing militarization of civilian police forces and how dangerous that's clearly becoming.
Yeah, and we know the training is also inducing much more of an aggressive, I would say, very callous macho image. So these are not people being trained to serve and support the general public. These are people who are effectively playing at being special forces. And if you look at the style of the people, the muscle, the tattoos, the jeans, the guns strapped on, these are very dangerous people because they're playing. Of course, they're never going to have to face a really dangerous enemy because they're never going to be put on a battlefield. They're going to face civilians.
Indeed. Right, Mark, we're right out of time. So just some closing comments on that or anything else, in fact.
Well, I think it'd be very relevant to say that the only person who is potentially a nominee for 3 positions for Trump is former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and Giuliani is being considered to head the Department of Homeland Security. We had a slight power glitch there. Giuliani is considered for Department of Homeland Security and possibly to head the Director of National Intelligence over the CIA, as well as possibly being Secretary of State. So Giuliani is the only one that could be nominated for any one of 3 posts. He's very, very militant. If he were to head the Department of Homeland Security, you could bet that there'd be more aggressive police in the near future in the U.S., not less. So I think that's the most relevant thing to say, because a lot of this is born of the Department of Homeland Security supplying excess military gear surplus to local police forces, and the police get in on this booty, on this largesse, and that's what helps cause this mindset of aggression against, in this case, the North Dakota protesters. Of course, all of that is partially attributable to still being over-reliant on crude oil as an energy source, which of course is unnecessary.
Yeah.
So I would leave it with that for now.
Okay, well, Mark, thank you very much for that. I wonder whether your power outage was in fact the result of a Russian EMP weapon. So maybe we've got an exclusive there, or maybe it was just a glitch. Okay.
Maybe a storm brewing here a little bit, but sorry about that. At least the sound kept going.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, that brings us to the end of today's UK column. If you like what we do, if you'd like to help keep, I was going to say alternative, but I'm going to say proper media going, consider taking out a subscription or making a donation, because we can only do what we do with your help and support. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.